now listening to Protecting Your Nest with board-certified family medicine and obesity medicine specialist Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com. Welcome to Protecting Your Nest podcast. Many people in the world of conventional medicine, where I train, either have not been exposed to great stories of healing through nutrition, don't believe patients are disciplined to heal with nutrition, or maybe, as Nina Taisho suggested in her podcast episode, don't have confidence in nutrition as a source of healing because previous recommendations have been based on the dietary guidelines that are not likely to lead to success. So if the dietary guidelines are not the answer, where does the answer lie? The reality is that many of my previous guests and I have personally seen what can happen when the right diet is given to the right patient. Today's guest has used diet to help put into remission many medical health conditions, but unlike many who encourage this approach, he takes it a little further, and through some personal experience and by helping his dad, has been able to make dietary suggestions that are individualized based on the particular needs of the person he is attempting to help heal. If you or somebody you love is suffering from mental illness, this podcast episode was made just for you. Once you hear our guest story, hope will be restored and new possibilities will emerge. Today's guest is Matt Jain, who is an autonomic neuroscientist, nutritionist, functional medicine, and mental health practitioner. He's also a keynote speaker and author of his inspirational book, Saving Dad. His work builds upon 100 years of autonomic neuroscience, including that of Dr. Beard, Pavlo, Price, Pottinger, Funkenstein, Gellhorn, Kelly, and Gonzalez. He helps people to resolve mental illness and chronic disease using diet. He also developed an online program entitled A New Model for Mental Health, the Scientific Foundations and Practical Applications of Treating Depression, Bipolar, and Schizophrenia Using Nutrition. Matt Jain, I am so happy and excited to welcome you to Protecting Your Nest. How are you doing today?
Oh, thank you, Tony. It's a real pleasure to talk with you from over the pond. Yeah, I'm doing really well. Thank you.
That's right. How far over the pond are you for my listeners? I'm in the
United States.
the
UK. Right? I'm in the northwest of the UK, and probably the closest place people will have heard of is Liverpool, home of the Beatles.
So you're where those. So now on the Beatles, you have those COVID variants.
We do. I think we've sent them your way too, haven't we?
That's right.
I'm
so we love you guys. That's right.
To apologize on behalf of the nation.
That's okay. We appreciate the love, and it's okay. Hopefully our vaccines will hold us nice and steady, and it's awesome. So, the more I have guests like yourself, the more thankful I am, that I actually am in school studying biochemistry and, basic science courses, talking about autonomic and sympathetic nervous system. So we'll get into that. So I really appreciate that. And I'm telling you, being in school really makes the conversations a little easier. So, but before we get started talking about mental health, which is going to be the focus of today's talk, let's go in the opposite direction. And when you think about the things you do to relax, for me, it's like movies, and I listen to podcasts. I even listen to books. I don't read as much. I just listen. Tell me what you do to relax. What's your sense of relaxation? What do you do?
Well, the big one, I share some with you, but the big one really is actually riding a motorbike. So,
really?
I get lost in riding. So I find there's nothing that gives more of a sense of freedom and relaxation than riding a bike. And you can't really concentrate on anything else when you're, riding a motorcycle. And I absolutely adore it. And it was something I loved from a very young age. So I remember having a little toy Suzuki, but I wasn't allowed to get a proper bike later in life. As a lot of people say, that's dangerous, and
right.
I guess they are. But as we'll probably come on to talk about, I learned as an adult that life can be pretty dangerous itself without things like that. So I decided that, once things had happened, which we'll come on to, I'm sure, big events in my life, that I was going to do what I thought was going to make me happy. And one of those things was riding a motorbike, and I just love it.
That's nice. I think you're right. Most parents get nervous about bicycles, but what I've heard from a few people I knew, patients really, who ride motorbikes, they say it's nothing. It's like flying a plane. It's like it's hard to explain. I've never experienced it, but it may end up on my to-do list. Inspired by you.
It's like a meditation, riding a bike.
Yeah, that is so crazy. Yeah, I like to experience different things, so maybe that'll be something that our listeners will put on their to-do list as well. So I love it. So, and you're still with us, so clearly it's safe enough. So you just have to do the right things to be safe. So that's perfect.
Yeah.
So that's great. So great. That was our icebreaker. So let's go to some thoughts related to the topic of the day. And I know you and your dad have personal stories as it relates to the challenges you both have faced dealing with mental illness. So let's kind of go into your dad and your story just to get a feel for your past and dealing with mental illness.
Yeah. In fact, I wondered, would you mind, I thought a nice way to introduce it might be just to read the short prologue from my book.
Absolutely. I love that.
Quite nicely.
Let's do that.
Okay, so I was 3 years old when I first witnessed the devastating effects of depression. On a winter's morning in 1975, as I pedaled my beloved plastic tricycle into the kitchen, I saw my dad sobbing in Mum's arms. Whilst being cradled, he was repeating the words, "I can't, I can't." Although at the time I was too young to understand, the scene I witnessed was Dad's first battle with bipolar disorder. Over the years, this mental illness has caused him to cycle between exhilarating highs and the depths of despair. Until recently, this book didn't have an ending. Since this is the true story of my life, I had to be patient enough for it to write its own. Recently, it did just that. So that's the prologue. And my dad's journey with mental illness has actually lasted for 45 years. And it's been an extraordinary journey of struggle, of suffering, but also of revelation. A life lived alongside bipolar disorders. It's like riding a roller coaster. And that's led to many thrilling times as well as desperate ones where hospitalization and suicide attempts were unfortunately part of life. But I think one of the key things to point out is that over a period of 4 decades, my dad was at the mercy of traditional psychiatry. So that meant pharmaceuticals and electroconvulsive therapy. But as the story unfolds, we reached a point where my dad was out of treatment options. Nothing was working, and he was lying in the fetal position on the bed of a psychiatric ward. So I went searching for answers myself to my father's distress. And I found it buried in science, which has been lost to history. So it's that journey that I talk about in the book. But now it's my life's purpose to bring this approach that you've alluded to into other people's lives so that they too can achieve mental health without relying upon pharmacology.
Yeah, I had a chance to have a conversation with Amber O'Hearn. And you're familiar with her?
Yes.
Yeah, she's so smart. She's another reason why I'm happy I'm in school, because she really kind of gets granular with the science.
Yeah.
And I really thank her for being out there and helping people. And so that's definitely an episode, if anybody hadn't heard that, to check out. Just when we did a YouTube version after the podcast, and that during that version, she talked about bipolar. And it was just incredible to see a person literally heal, or at least put it in remission and she's not even taking medicine. It's so
Yeah.
perplexing. So I just think that's incredible. So thank you for sharing. I love the way you, read the story. And, I'm actually working on an obesity book now. And I'm like, I need to actually be a better storyteller. I have to describe the environment and all the other things that go into, because I tend to be like a doctor. I'm thinking like a scientist, and I need to
Sure.
tell a story. So I really appreciate that. So I guess the next question I have is, having a dad with mental illness. I'm curious, how your, maybe a little bit about your own struggle with behavioral health, and what is it like? Just, I want us to kind of, just like that beautiful movie, Beautiful Mind. I want to like see the world through your lens. So what was it like to have, things that, as it relates to depression and things like that? What is it like for you to live in that body and experience that?
Well, I mean, my story really, it runs my own personal experience with mental illness, and specifically depression, really runs alongside that of my dad. So I've got two experiences really, and the first one is an observation, as you heard from my book, from a very, very young age, of seeing the man who I idolized sort of all my life go through this struggle. So there's great sadness and pain involved, great empathy. And I think as I've grown older, there's been a greater desire to try and help resolve some of that for him. It's terrible to watch someone suffer. And then from my own experience, I started out in life, in corporate life. So I originally studied business. So I've had a huge transformation. And my corporate career was halted in its tracks, ended really by my depressive episodes. So it's been very, very real in terms of the impact that it's had on my life. But an example would be, when I was at university, I was completely knocked for six by a very severe depressive episode of my father's. And it was really the first time, I suppose, outside of the very early years, that I'd seen him very, very ill. And this was prior to my first year exams. So I came home to study for those exams. And upon arrival at the house, Dad literally fell into my arms crying, and was the shadow of the man that I'd idolized all my life. And it was a real pivotal moment for me. It was kind of the mirror image of that I'd seen when I was 3, when Mum was holding Dad in her arms. And now, me, age 19, it was me who was doing the cradling. And then the trauma really of experiencing that sent me into my own depressive episode, during which I had absolutely no energy and struggled to function. And as I say, I was about to take my university exams. So I had to down my books. I couldn't revise, couldn't concentrate. And, it had a huge impact on me. I mean, I did carry on and take those exams, and they turned out just fine, kind of ironically.
Right.
But, my life's been very greatly impacted by mental illness.
Yeah, you're a smart guy, so you survived in spite of that. But I tell you, even as I'm trying to be a busy clinician, leader, father, the whole family, whenever I have a struggle during my current training, it affects my grades on my quizzes. So I'm not as smart as you, because it just.
Well, I was given advice by my personal tutor, who I went to see for advice, and said that, I'm really struggling here. What should I do?
So
She
which,
said,
yeah.
you've got a choice to make. You can either carry on and take the exams, or you could, given everything you've been through, you could delay them. And she said, but either way, you need to down your books and just look after your well-being. So I entered those exams probably in the calmest place of my life, because I think I just entered a space where I wasn't doing the traditional of just hitting the books all the time. I've done a lot of prep before, but I think my state of mind was different. I was calmer going into them.
That makes sense, because one of the things we try to do is put all this information in our head, and yet we don't really realize you need to take breaks, you need to pause, you need to frame how you reframe your brain around, let me just give an example. So when I think about masters in nutrition, I have to tell myself I've been striving to be an A student most of my life. So what I've done now is say, well, I don't have to be an A student. I can just be a B student. It's okay not to get a 95 on a quiz. It's okay. So I had
give yourself some wiggle room.
Yeah, because it's too much on your plate. So, but for you to have the experience with your dad, I was able to visualize that as you described, literally cradling your dad.
Yeah.
And just visualizing that. That's why your book sounds like a good read, because I haven't fully read it yet. I just got like an overview, but I'm going to tell you something. It sounds like exactly the kind of story that I would love to read. So I really appreciate that. I do want to ask another question, which is dealing with, I had Nina Teicholz on previously, and she shared the new dietary guidelines. And she talked about dietary patterns and things like that. So I know that, there's some dietary patterns historically that are different than our current dietary patterns. And I was curious if, you could kind of talk a little bit about the different dietary patterns from the past and contrast them, and how that way of just understanding that will help us understand why we're in the mess we're in right now.
Yeah, I love Nina's work. I love her book, Big Fat Surprise. I think she's a great truth teller, talking against the mainstream narrative about what we should eat. But in terms of, my experience and kind of the origins of how I came to help my dad, if you look at the work of Dr. Weston Price, now he was a dentist and epidemiologist, and he traveled the world over a period of 8 years and lived with 14 different tribes from 14 different countries to try and, as a dentist, originally his purpose was to find out what the driver of dental decay was. But he went on to learn many, many things about both physical and mental health. But the two most important learnings in that were that different people thrive on different diets. So there's no one diet for everyone. And then when they follow the diet which is suited to their individual biochemistry, they remain free of physical and mental illness. So he found that when people followed their traditional diet, whether that be, say, the Eskimos of Alaska or the Incas of the high Andes, there was no incidence of arthritis, asthma, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, or mental illness. And he met with doctors in his travels who confirmed this to be the case. And it was only when the descendants of these traditional people moved into the towns where the Western diet was available did they suffer the diseases of modern civilization. So his work debunks the myth that we should all follow one diet, and it proves that disease is not the natural order of life, but health is. And I think if only the people who designed the government guidelines and associated food pyramid had read the work of Dr. Weston Price, there wouldn't be the confusion that surrounds nutrition and health that we have today.
That's bizarre. You said dentists.
Yeah.
I was already shocked that Nina and Gary Taubes were journalists who opened our eyes.
Yeah, indeed.
And shout out to all the dentists.
Indeed, yeah.
Dr. Price is a dentist who was able to show this difference, and that's just amazing. So that's really just really reassuring. So that we all have a role to play, and we have to listen to each other. And when you have a great doctor who discovers there's something here, guys, you just want people to listen. And I'm just thankful that you also was able to go backwards and listen to these great minds. I just love that. So, wow. So it's interesting. We've heard your story of mental illness. We've heard a little bit about your dad. Your thoughts on where mental illness comes from, because a lot of people are focused on, let's look at the neurotransmitter that's, not right. And we just kind of give you a medicine to fix that. But, I've learned through my functional medicine training, which is why I was happy to hear you had that kind of background, that the root cause and maybe even the solution is broader than just one neurotransmitter. So could you talk a little bit about your idea of where this comes from?
So, well, again, looking at the findings of other doctors in history, Doctors Funkenstein and Gellhorn that you mentioned at the kind of top of the show, they each conducted investigations over a period of 30 years, which demonstrated that actually mental illness lies in an imbalanced autonomic nervous system. And for people that don't know, the autonomic nervous system is that system over which we have no conscious control, but it's involved in all metabolism, immune function, our thoughts, emotions, respiration, and cardiovascular function. And perhaps the easiest way for listeners to understand the system is through the example of, say, our blood pressure or body temperature. So our body's constantly trying to keep these within safe parameters by constantly adjusting the two branches of this autonomic nervous system, which are called the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches. And when it comes to mental illness, Dr. Funkenstein, who was a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, he compared the balance of these two branches in his students and in his psychiatric patients. And he discovered that whilst his medical students had balance between the two branches, his psychiatric patients had dominance in either the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system. And that determined the type of mental illness that they suffered from. So then he was able to divide his patients into groups according to this balance in the system and tailored their treatment accordingly to restore both balance in the system and mental health. And then when he retested them after they'd recovered from the mental illness, he found that autonomic balance had been restored. So that provided the insight that mental illness is the result of an imbalance in the autonomic nervous system. And then Dr. Gellhorn, who was a professor of neurophysiology at the University of Minnesota, he conducted the same investigations into the role of the autonomic nervous system in mental illness. And despite him approaching it from a completely different angle, he found exactly the same results. So it was through these doctors' experience that when my own father was suffering and I was looking for answers, that I had to go back essentially 100 years in total into science, as I say, before has been lost to history, and resurrect it, because I found answers there. And whilst the likes of Funkenstein and Gellhorn were using the treatments available to them at their day, which would have been amphetamines and tranquilizers and ECT, I learned through other doctors, namely Kelly and Gonzalez, that the same thing could be done to what we call reflex tune this autonomic nervous system back into balance using nutrients. So yeah, that's kind of the backstory to, and that kind of debunks the chemical imbalance theory, which I think more and more people are beginning to realize isn't the true picture. But in the absence of that, people don't really know where to look. And as I say, I had to go searching a very, very long and deep path to uncover it.
It's perplexing that, again, it took a little investigative journalism, just like Nina and Gary, and because you were at a moment of crisis with your dad, it forced you to look outside the box and think outside the box and see things differently. And it's almost like you uncovered some great scientists who it's almost like they were forgotten. I mean, why hasn't this science, was it political reasons why these people's approaches weren't known?
I think there's a couple of different hypotheses. That one is that the work has been ignored in the face of other things, and then I think the other one that you have to kind of examine it is that at the same time as some of these discoveries were being made was at the same time as things like hydrazine, the first antidepressants were being developed in the 50s, and then there was a huge amount of effort and money being spent on first developing a market for depression and other mental illnesses, and then filling that market with the likes of pharmaceuticals. So I know that Gonzalez tells a story of Dr. Gellhorn, who was a professor for 30 years at the University of Minnesota. And he called them to inquire about him, see what they had on him, and they didn't know who he was. And I've just touched on it. He went very, very far into this. So
Sure.
Even to the extent where he examined the control center of the autonomic nervous system, which is the hypothalamus. And he discovered that not only does it send neuronal projections downwards through the body, but it also sends projections up to the cortex. As you all know, the frontal cortex is where our thinking and our perception of the world is derived from. And he realized that in getting people well, he was manipulating the autonomic nervous system, reflex tuning, as he called, which was not only having these projections downwards, but it was also really creating balance in people's thinking and their behavior through these projections upwards to the prefrontal cortex. So he mapped all of this out. He wrote 9 textbooks and 400 clinical papers. But try and find someone that's read any of them.
Oh my goodness. That's mind-boggling. So it sounds pretty in some ways simple and in other ways complex. The part that feels complex to me is figuring out where you lie on this spectrum. So my assumption is the work you're doing is to help people figure out where they lie on this balanced spectrum with those two, nervous systems, and then helping them then, figure out which diet. And it sounds like some of the work that the previous scientists and doctors and dentists have done has given you the template. And you're kind of just applying what you've learned, and you've done your own little experiment, and you saw it's working. So now you're expanding that so other people can. Yeah. So that's.
I mean, unfortunately, they're all dead. Gonzalez was the last to pass in 2015. So there's no one practicing it. And he was largely, although he did treat many other illnesses, but his most published work and that he's most famous for is in advanced cancer. So there's no one doing this for mental illness. And, so it's important for me to keep it alive because otherwise it'll be lost to history.
Yeah, people need options. I would never say to a patient who needs in a crisis to take a medicine that's going to work for them. I think that's absolutely appropriate in a crisis moment. But man, people need hope that there's another way to get to that. This whole podcast is based on a root cause. And what I loved about, having an opportunity to talk to you is that for those who hadn't heard this message, there's a root cause that you hadn't heard of. And it's these sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the nervous system. So it's really hopeful. So I know we're dealing with depression and bipolar, schizophrenia, maybe anxiety, things like that. How much of this teaching affects other conditions that you've seen, ADHD, autism, anything else out there that seems to benefit from this approach?
Well, from an autonomic perspective, ADHD is driven by an overactive sympathetic nervous system. But that's only part of the picture. And I think people in the US especially are at particular risk of developing these conditions that you mentioned due to toxicity, so herbicides and pesticides used in agriculture. There's a great documentary called Secret Ingredients, which I recommend that people watch, and it proves beyond doubt the role of these chemicals in causing illnesses such as ADHD and autism. So, I mean, they go through live examples of children that are struggling, that aren't talking, in early development, and the parents change the diet to organic and grass-fed beef, and these illnesses, they go away. And I think toxicity is huge. And that was one of the 3 pillars that Gonzalez used in cancer patients, was detoxification, which I think, we're subjected to, they say, up to 79,000 environmental pollutants today. And detoxification is very overlooked. But yes, so the likes of ADHD and autism are implicated, but I think it goes beyond autonomic neuroscience, although ADHD, as I say, is implicated. I think in the quality of the foods that we eat and the nutritional value of those foods is really, really important.
Yeah, I am. What I'm taking right now is how to read research studies. That's one of my classes, which is, very helpful, especially when you're talking to Gary Taubes and Nita Teichels.
Yeah.
You got to know how to look at the science. But the other class is toxicology, and we were not trained on toxicology in any way. And what I'm learning is that is what you don't put in your body that's helpful. It's what you kind of get out of your body. You could have never told me that going to a sauna is going to somehow help you. Yeah. And I was talking to the one of my good friends, the Black carnivore, Ade Fox, and I talked to her a little bit about this idea of using sweating, and she told the story about how there was a scenario where alcohol was consumed, and the sweating, you can actually smell the alcohol.
Really? Yeah. It's one of our main detoxification organs, isn't it? The skin. So
it is.
It makes sense.
I never learned that. Right. I didn't learn that but in this training, this functional medicine training, I'm learning that that's probably one. So, and that's why in some cultures they have saunas. It's just it's like in their house. Yeah. So, and maybe one day in the future, with the permission of my wife, I'll be able to get a sauna in my house.
That's a good reason to get one.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, it stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, which looks after detoxification, heat. So going back to Weston Price, people that lived nearer the equator, they would follow a more of a plant-based diet. And there's no coincidence that a plant-based diet stimulates the parasympathetic nerves, as does heat. So their environment and the foods which suited their individual biochemistry the most was in alignment. But of course, it's always overlooked. Everyone always says there's only one diet for everybody, whether, that be vegans saying it, or vegetarians or carnivores or whatever. But the truth is that there isn't one diet to suit everyone. And I can manipulate someone's health and nervous system by giving them different foods because of the nutrients contained within those foods. It's absolutely obvious to me.
Yeah. And I love that you use the example of a plant-based diet. And Dr. Terry Mason was my first guest on the podcast, right? Who was vegan. And, and the reason why I wanted to bring him along for a visit to the podcast is to say it loud and clear to all my low carb and keto and carnivore friends and family and listeners, is that there's more than one way. Now you could argue in a world where insulin resistance is predominant, that for a lot of people it may end up being a low carb approach. But I think that we have to hear each other, and if we have methods that are in a slightly different direction, who cares? All we're trying to do is be metabolically healthy.
That's right.
So that our friends and family and the people we serve are not having to live with mental illness. So thank you for giving that example, because I think that if we don't have that type of approach, we're going to only, be fighting each other instead of listening to each other. So that's very great.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
I see people achieving health through different approaches to diet. Some people thrive on some plant-based and others on a lot of red meat, for instance. But I think it's important. What I would say outside of that, it's important to note that certainly when Dr. Weston Price went around the world, he found no traditional tribe who ate an exclusively plant-based diet. They all ate some animal protein, whether that be eggs or perhaps yogurt in the case of the traditional Swiss, for example. And the same was true of Dr. Kelly and Dr. Gonzalez's patients. So there's even their sympathetic dominants, as they're called, who would be following a plant-based diet to try and cure a tumor-based cancer, for example. They required some animal protein to achieve health. And, there's a huge rise in veganism and vegetarianism, isn't there? And let's see how that one plays out. And one of the clients who features in as a case study, actually, in my online program, she was very heavy plant-based before she consulted with me. And she'd eaten that way for years. And when I gave her my nutritional recommendations for her individual biochemistry, she was horrified because it went against everything she believed about food. But within a month of following the diet, her mental illness had resolved, and she was back to leading her company.
There you go.
So, it just needs tailoring. And the basis of it in this model is autonomic neuroscience.
And just being open to experimentation.
Yeah.
I think that's key. I'm kind of, as I listen to you, I'm praying. I say, when I do my dominant brain type, I'm praying that it says I need to eat a whole lot of beef. So we'll see. But either way, another thing I tweeted recently, for those who follow me on Twitter, I did a tweet, you may have seen that, where I mentioned that you need protein, you need amino acids for phase 2 of detoxification.
Yes, so, I did see that, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like, so even as I learned this from my nutrition professors, they had to acknowledge that for a lot of people, like you've suggested, protein's important. Yeah. I am curious, though, when it comes to having a dominant brain type, what happens if are there patients who don't really have, it's like a mixture, and how do you handle that when their brain type is not clear?
Well, there is a third group. So it breaks down into sympathetic dominant, parasympathetic dominant, and balanced metabolizers. So for some people, their illness is driven by both branches being weak. And there is it's probably not very surprising, but the balanced metabolizers need a mix of plant-based and animal-based products, but they all need to be derived from good quality, nutritionally dense foods. Because you could follow a vegetarian diet and eat corn chips and Coca-Cola, couldn't you? And it'd still be vegetarian. But yeah, there's a third group where both branches of the autonomic nervous system can be weak. And we see that in bipolar, which is why people swing between mania and melancholic depression, is because both of those branches need supporting. So, so I can usually tell by meeting someone what they should be eating, because personality type, psychological traits are an important part of the mix. And then some clues that they give away in chatting to them about things like the health challenges that they've had in the past. So your point about hopefully sort of steak forms part of your diet, I can pretty much tell by your personality that it will do, because people that need red meat in their diet, which means they need to acidify their diet, they are usually pretty laid back. They're usually people. They usually get on with people, and the way you kind of present and talk, I think, is that, rather than your type A's who are very, very nice. So military leaders and leaders of countries and all the rest of it, companies. And the type A's with a very dominant left brain, academics, good runners, usually slim, high adrenal function, high thyroid function, good respiration, strong heart rate. They're usually the sympathetics that benefit from a plant-based diet. So you can usually tell once you know it. Tell. Yeah, by talking to someone. And then if you can't, you can go into health history, things like allergies. So parasympathetic dominants are prone to allergies because the calcium leaches out of the cell, which makes the cell membrane leaky. So allergens and pathogens can get into the cell and mediators of inflammation can get out of the cell. So that leads to allergies. Now, that's only the case in parasympathetic dominance. So sympathetic dominance could stand behind a bus and not get allergies. They've got very tight membranes due to calcium in the cell. So if someone tells me that they've got asthma and they might have psoriasis or eczema, for instance, it gives me clues as to where they are on the balance and what they need to eat accordingly.
I love it. You're taking us to school, and I appreciate that. It was funny because when I started my training, they had a prerequisite that we had to take biochemistry. And that was the first time, because I have an MBA, I have a little business background myself. And so I'm thinking, I'm a doctor, why I got to take biochemistry? I'm just, why would I need a prerequisite, right? But then as I listen to you, I start to understand why. You got to understand some biochemistry.
It's absolutely crucial. I mean, for instance, the reason that leafy green vegetables are green is because of their magnesium content. When you're looking at a leafy green, you're looking at magnesium. And the reason for that is the center molecule of chlorophyll, which makes them green, is magnesium. And magnesium blocks the sympathetic nerves and boosts the parasympathetic nerves. So you can manipulate your nervous system by eating different kinds of foods. And that's kind of where the magic happens, by bringing people back into autonomic balance through using the correct nutrients. But the key thing is, you've got to understand the science and then which foods are applicable to you as an individual. Otherwise, you can cause mayhem. I can send someone into mania. I can send someone melancholically depressed by giving them the wrong foods. So it's so important to know, and it is individual, and it's largely thought to be genetic. So we really do need to identify as individuals what we should be eating, and then we can avoid illness and disease.
Right. This is the future of medicine, and I just love the fact that this approach will allow people who are not being, first of all, you can start your journey knowing up front what's likely to work for you, right?
Yeah.
And what we do is we say everybody needs to be a carnivore, everybody needs to be keto, everybody needs to be vegan. We're not going to do that. We're going to say, let's look at you as an individual. We have some data that would help guide us. Let's use that data. And now, just like Dr. Eric Westman would say, he said, when people come see me, I have to be successful because people think I'm a world leader in this way of, so I think this is wonderful because for those who are struggling, they now have an additional tool in their toolkit, and hopefully the resources that you provide, will share that in the show notes. But I really am excited about just hearing that you can actually look at an individual and help them. And I'm also smiling because you mentioned that I had the personality to keep eating my steak. So ever since you said, I'm like, I got this like smiling emoji. If I can send a smiling emoji through this podcast, I would. So thank you for that. I'm feeling, when I go see my
it's your genetics. I didn't do anything.
It's okay. So I'm loving that. So anyway, so let's talk a little bit about, I mentioned earlier that in crisis, you may need medicine. So I just want to understand where medicine fits in this paradigm. Is that part of what you do? Do you have colleagues that you work with? Tell me a little bit about the role of medicines in patients who suffer from mental illness.
So in terms of the work I do, meds do not play any role at all. So I exclusively use nutrition to restore mental health. And that's because, the largest impact of every nutrient, whether that be a vitamin, mineral, or trace element, beyond what they may do to influence, say, immune function, detoxification, or whatever, is their impact on the autonomic nervous system. So that's why I can so successfully use nutrients to reflex tune people back into balance. and I see extraordinary outcomes. But I've got a lot of experience with pharmacology in the sense that my father was treated with every psychiatric drug you can think of over a period of 40 years. And my clients often come to me on several different medications. So something I see that's different between the US and the UK is that I think is probably a byproduct of the fact that pharmaceutical meds are advertised on television there and it's illegal to do so here, is that my clients who are very often from the US are on more than one medication, whereas in the UK, they're either on none or maybe one. So it's a different experience according to who I'm dealing with and in the world. But I think, other than the fact that my concentration is on nutrition, I think there's several problems with psychiatric medication. But one of them is that they're not tailored to the individual's biochemistry. So biomarkers are not used prior to prescribing. It's a one-size-fits-all approach. So typically, if someone's diagnosed with depression, they're given an SSRI, a serotonin-based antidepressant. But people who are suffering from depression who are parasympathetic dominant, they already have an overabundance of circulating serotonin. So SSRIs actually make them worse. And I experienced this myself 20 years ago when I took Prozac. I felt absolutely terrible on it. And my dad's the same. He does terribly on SSRIs. So meds play no role in my practice, whilst people do come to me on meds. But I think we can, for those people that work in that field or who are interested in taking meds, we can be a lot more refined by tailoring the drug to the individual's biochemistry. Because as I say, they do manipulate the nervous system, as nutrition does too. But we don't use biomarkers. We use questionnaires to identify whether someone's suffering from, say, depression. But we can get a lot more sophisticated than that. It's just not practiced. Mm-hmm. We don't individualize like that, unfortunately.
It seems like it would be hard to mimic the totality of what nutrition would do, because it seems like nutrition would not just impact one neurotransmitter, serotonin, norepinephrine. It would impact all of them. And so to mimic that with medicine would be a challenge. Would you agree to that?
Yes, I would. I mean, both affect us systemically, for sure. The reason why people often get upset stomachs when they take an SSRI is because there's 95% of the serotonin we produce is in the gut. So you have to look at it consistently. But I know from suggesting to people different diets that the likes of, say, red meat contains tyrosine and phenylalanine, which are the precursors to the two main sympathetic neurotransmitters, epinephrine and norepinephrine. So by taking red meat, especially fatty red meat, you can boost those sympathetic nerves. And if someone is dominant on the other branch, as I am, a parasympathetic dominant, something like red meat or fatty fish, like trout, can have immediate effects upon the brain chemistry, but without any side effects. That's the other big picture, is that things like gut health and having stomach upsets and having problems with withdrawal off meds, which is a huge problem. The using nutrition takes that out of the picture, and you can very carefully manipulate someone back into balance using the nutrients in food. So why wouldn't you use that approach than pharmaceuticals, which have got a pretty potted history when it comes to side effects, in my opinion?
Yeah, it's almost like we need an entire new field of medicine combined with the basic knowledge that a primary care doc like myself could have. So, for example, I treat depression, anxiety. I tend to refer people for bipolar, schizophrenia to my behavioral health colleagues. Yet I could refill those medicines on their behalf. Yeah. But it's almost like we need that same model where we have people who really focus on nutrition to treat certain conditions while teaching the current professionals to do it as well. Maybe some will specialize in it because it may be complex. So, but in fact, speaking of complex, could you give an example of if somebody comes in and they have a sympathetic dominant type, for example? I think our listeners would be interested in hearing what that looks like in terms of treatment, in terms of what types of diets, and I guess we could touch on supplements as well. But let's give us a visual of what that would look like. So a person that's being treated for a particular brain type, what would that look like?
So, in terms of mental health, if someone's sympathetic dominant, it means that branch is dominant, and the opposing branch, the parasympathetic system, is weak. And those people would come to me with schizophrenia or when they're in a manic phase of bipolar. So there's an overexcitation on the sympathetic branch. And the treatment for that is plant-based. So as I've sort of touched on previously, the things like leafy greens, because they contain magnesium, they inhibit those very strong, active sympathetic nerves. So they calm that branch. And in calming that branch, because there's two areas of the hypothalamus, the anterior and the posterior, and they have mutually inhibitory neurons running between them. So as one branch dials up, the other dials down, and you're always trying to seek balance between the two systems. So if you give somebody leafy greens, and therefore magnesium, in calming the sympathetic branch, you're boosting the parasympathetic branch, which results in autonomic balance. And when we have autonomic balance, we have health, both physical and mental. So that would be the diet that somebody that was suffering from that in terms of mental illness. And then you can apply the same model to physical illness too. So hyperadrenal, hyperthyroid, high blood pressure, these are all the work of an overactive sympathetic nervous system. So the answer is to calm that branch and boost the opposing branch. So that would be the way you do it through diet. It's largely plant-based, but as I say, you'd need some animal protein in there too. So that might be an egg or two a day, yogurt. But then, you asked about supplements. You can use supplements in the same regard. So you can take magnesium citrate and potassium citrate. So magnesium citrate will inhibit the sympathetic nervous system, and potassium will boost the parasympathetic system. So you can use those two nutrients to manipulate the nervous system. And then there's a real host of other ones, manganese, chromium, things like that, ALAs, plant-based fats. So there's a long list. And so in my online program, what I do is, you talk about trying to get the knowledge out there. I first go through all of the science so people can understand the foundations of this approach. But then I give people exactly what foods they need to be eating for their type. And that includes foods and supplements and dosing of those supplements. So you can get to learn where you sit on the spectrum. And if you can't work it out, you can just take a blood test and find out the pH, the acid base of your blood, if you wanted a true biomarker. And then you can follow the model and eat the foods to manipulate your nervous system back into balance and get your pH back to 7.42, which is kind of homeostasis. So it gives everybody the science and the practical application of that to get back into balance. So yeah, that's the sympathetic branch. And then on the other side, so people that come to me with a very melancholic depression, with low mood and lost interest in things, no energy, they need to acidify the diet. So that's done through a host of other different foods. So largely meat-based diet, especially fatty red meat, hopefully grass-fed if people can afford it, fatty fish, and then there's a host of other foods that complement those. So people that go carnivore, I find this a lot, that people might try carnivore to improve their mental health. They don't know what they can eat with it. Mm-hmm. So they get a very narrow diet, and they're scared then to deviate from that diet. Mm-hmm. But there are very specific foods that can complement that to excite your sympathetic nervous system, which complements meat really well. And then the supplements that do the same. So through a suite of different nutrients, you can bring about balance and overcome mental illness.
I am definitely going to be looking into my brain type because I do want to optimize my health. I think my carnivore friends out there who are listening will absolutely be interested in doing the same, because you're right. There is this fear. I just have to do it strictly this way, and to know that there may be some things that they can add back. And they've already kind of done these experiments. They already know there's certain things they can tolerate. But I think having a little bit more science to support it will add tremendous value. So I really appreciate that. It's so important. So thank you for touching on, the supplements, and because I think a lot of people are really interested in a quick fix, but I really don't want anybody to think that way. I want people to say, hey, what do I need to do in totality? And that'll, in fact, speaking of that, when I think about the concept of the NEST, which deals with, nutrition, exercise, less stress, more sleep, positive thinking, and I haven't even gotten to the rope, but, that's just talking about that. So when you think about those things, as you help patients on their journey, how much energy is put into those other root causes of disease with that acronym as an example?
Yeah, so it's part of the consideration. And in fact, before I concentrated upon nutrition, I actually did a huge amount of work around stress reduction, and that was involving things like meditation. So just like nutrition, exercise has a profound effect on the autonomic nervous system. So fast exercise stimulates the sympathetic branch, whereas meditation and some forms of, say, slow breath work stimulates the parasympathetic system through the vagus nerve. So you can reflex tune your nervous system back into balance with the different types of exercise. But of course, people without a knowledge of the underlying science probably don't know which exercise suits what. So again, it comes down to having a foundational understanding of the science and what impact these things have on you. So for instance, sleep is the work of the parasympathetic system. Without engaging it, you can't sleep, which is why people find it hard to sleep when they're stressed. So remember that the sympathetic system is our stress system, which works against us when we want to sleep. So in my practice, I give people advice about exercise and sleep. For example, I give advice that people use, say, blue light blocking glasses when they're using computers or their mobile phone in the late afternoon and evening, because that helps to stop the stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, when you're approaching evening and bedtime, because that's going to work against you when you put your head on the pillow.
I love it.
So I do think of those things.
Yeah, well, I'm happy. Actually, in partnership with the Diet Doctor, I have a low carb corner page on their website, and I write a monthly column with them. The last article is, in fact, I'll share some links to that, but you can either search on my website, drtonyhampton.com, and there's a link. It's LC Corner, Low Carb Corner, at the top, or just Google Low Carb Corner, Dr. Tony Hampton. But the last article I wrote was on stress, but the one that's coming up next month in March 2021 is on sleep. So, and it's funny you bring up blue blockers because when we used to do our healthy living events where we teach in front of patients, I sung the little jingle. I think it went something like, my name is Geek. I put them on as a shocker. Hey, I love my blue blockers. This guy's on a beach, right, in California somewhere. I don't know if you recall that, but I sung the song for my patients to remind them that when you wear those, blue light blocking glasses, it actually does help sleep. So you had me at hello, but I just wanted to
Well,
make
if
sure
you're
people.
singing to your patients, you must be parasympathetic dominant, because they're the right brain creative people. So that's for
That is
sure.
so funny. Yeah, I anything to get their attention. So love it. So thank you, thank you. I'm happy. I wasn't sure what your response would be, but it's nice to know that you look at it holistically and look at all those other areas. But speaking of holistically, tell us a little bit about this functional medicine, the role of functional medicine, and what's your background with that? Because it's been eye-opening for me.
Yeah. So, I've taken a couple of functional medicine courses, and I think it's a great starting point to transition someone away from the standard American diet, in the US and in other countries, the sort of Western diet that's prevalent. So I think you've touched upon low carb, and I think functional medicine does a great job at informing practitioners that there's another way to approach nutrition, which actually goes against, unfortunately, the guidelines that were given, that is pretty heavy on carb. But the only thing I would say, there is a limitation in my mind in the fact that functional medicine doesn't take into account the autonomic nervous system and tailoring diet to balance it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think functional medicine doesn't recognize that. It does a lot of work around blood chemistry and supplementation, but it's usually based on one diet kind of fits all, trying to hit an optimum, but without the autonomic nervous system at its root. So to my mind, it was a very good foundational piece. But I think since having moved into autonomic neuroscience, it just gives me that extra critical element of being able to tailor diets to individuals.
I think if they are true scientists, and shout out to University of Western States. I always have to do a shout out when we talk about these topics where I actually am receiving my nutrition and functional medicine training. I think if they're true to science, they will evolve in that area. It's hard to
Yes, it's natural. You're right.
Yeah, they have to evolve and see it. So I think that's what I'm hoping. Because again, I had to discover you and this way of thinking as well. So, I'm the same way. Functional medicine was wonderful because it had me thinking outside the box.
Yeah.
You got me thinking outside the box. So I think we just have to, as we continue to grow as scientists, we'll say, hey, let's challenge our current hypothesis.
Yeah. And they're already using biomarkers, aren't they? So they're already in this way of thinking. It's not a huge leap then to realize that we need to consider that there isn't just one approach for everybody. I know they do a lot of tailoring in terms of blood profiles, but it isn't autonomic based.
This is a nice segue to the next thing I had in mind to ask you, which is, what's your true north? Like, where do you want to see the world in 5 years, 10 years as it relates to the work you're doing, or just globally, how you see healthcare and how we take care of patients?
Well, it took me 40 years to discover my true purpose in life. I thought I was destined for corporate boardrooms, but I think I've just since discovered that I was a healer. So, I want to spend the rest of my life, even beyond 5 years, to dedicate to helping people heal from mental illness. It's been such a big part of my journey. As I said in the prologue, from 3 years old, that I want to try and spread the word as much as possible. My online program hopefully will help people to do that, both physicians and nutritionists and clients, lay people alike. So, I'm in a very single-minded place, really, with wanting to continue this work and hopefully bring more and more people on board as we go. I started with the sole aim of healing my father. He used to have ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, every 2 weeks to stay out of hospital. And he had that for over a decade. So he's had hundreds and hundreds of courses of ECT. And since he's been following my nutritional protocol, he hasn't had any for 2 years. He takes no antidepressants. And he's better than he's been for over 10 years. and he's 78. So it just goes to show, what's possible. And I want other people to be aware, like you said earlier, that there's another way than the traditional. People may be listening to this struggling, and I can tell them, hand on heart, there is another way, and they needn't lose hope.
I love it. I hear the passion in your voice, and if I had a dad who had healed that way and I had personally healed that way, I'd want to shout it from the rooftop. So I thank God we have this way of sharing the message. And I'm doing my best to get this message out. But we got to make sure that the healer is also healing. And you've shared what you've done, in terms of your, how you deal with depression. But I'm curious, as it relates to my Nest and Rope acronym, when you think about the rope, the relationships and avoiding organisms, pollutants, you're protecting your emotions, making sure your life experiences serve you. And of course, the nest, nutrition, exercise, less stress, more sleep, avoiding trauma and how we think. When you think about your journey over the next year, where will Matt be putting his focus?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it all begins with awareness. So I have to be very, very careful with the relationships I expose myself to, the food I put in my body, the work I pursue. My genetics in this arena with mental illness are not great. My grandmother and grandfather also suffered greatly with depression. My uncle did, my dad did, and I've had 3 depressive episodes. Thankfully, now, with this approach, I don't struggle and I don't take meds, but I realize that I am vulnerable. So I'm very, very careful with making sure that everything is intentional. And I think that begins with awareness of knowing where you're at any one point in time and tailoring things accordingly. So I have to be very careful with my exposure to stress and sleep, and the way I think, my thought patterns and behaviors, doing detoxification procedures and taking the right supplements to do that. And of course, having the right diet. So it's a day by day journey and challenge for me. I really have to take it very seriously, but thankfully in doing so, it keeps me well.
Yeah, I love being on a journey. I think the biggest mistake we make in life is looking towards that goal and only focusing on it while not recognizing the journey. So I am absolutely a fan of that and appreciate you sharing your the way you're going to approach it. So let's think about final takeaways, and or more importantly, there are people listening who are like anxious to use the resources you have. So share how those resources can be, received, and any final thoughts or takeaways.
Yeah, so in terms of my own resources, if people go to my website, which is mattjanes.com, so that's Matt with 2 T's, and then JANES, that's N for November.com, they will find a series of resources. So there are videos, there's other podcasts where I explain this approach, but there's also access to my online program. So people can read reviews that other people have taken the program and their transformations, and they're all real clients. So I would, direct people towards mattjanes.com. I've also got articles on there where I talk about this approach and mental illness and things like cancer. So some of the work I've learned has been born out of cancer treatment. So, I know a fair bit about that too. So there's some articles around that. But the core is addressing this big journey that I've been on with trying to resolve mental illness. So, yeah, I'd send people there. But I think it's important you said about final thoughts and takeaways. And I touched upon hope earlier. And I think it's a key message for people to hear. is that you needn't lose hope. I've seen the very depths of despair. And in 2008, my father had a very, very severe suicide attempt. And I found him, and he was bleeding out, and he begged me to let him die. And from a place of complete darkness, he has overcome that suffering and is now thriving at the age of 78. So I think wherever you are, however low you're feeling, however difficult the struggle is, there is hope and there is light. And I know this to be true with every fabric of my being. And my father's living proof of that.
I love it. Now, your book will also be on your website as well, right?
Yes, it is.
And
It's on
probably
my
on
website.
Amazon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, you have really been a gift today. And I really hope that anybody listening who really is suffering or has a family member or is a clinician, this is an opportunity that we should do a little bit of an experiment at least to see if this will work for you, your family, or your patient. So I want to thank you again for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this, and I am just so happy and thrilled that we've had a chance to talk today. So thank you again.
Oh, thank you, Tony. I've really enjoyed speaking with you. It's been really delightful. Thank you.
Absolutely. So today, guys, we learned about an extraordinary practitioner who understands that if we focus on the root cause of mental illness, we may find a more effective way to treat it. Like Dr. Eric Westman at Duke in the U.S. and Dr. David and Jen Unwin in the U.K. with my partner here, they have both handed me a baton to continue the low-carb work, but Matt Jane was given a baton from Drs. Beard, Pavlo, Price, Pottinger, Funkenstein, Gellhorn, Kelly, and Gonzalez. And if we are to live our life purpose, we need to have a fully functional mind, one that is in balance and one that is given the proper nutrition to thrive. I know this is very exciting and is tempting for everyone to just simply get a list of supplements to fix this problem. But it's more complicated than that, as you've heard from Matt. So I suggest you consider Matt and his team and use them to help support you, your family, and if you're a clinician, your patients, so that they can achieve their goals, their mental health goals, with the right support. I'll make sure to share in the show notes the links to Matt's resources. And I would also love to hear from you about your thoughts about this episode and in general, the podcast in general. So share your thoughts by commenting in the Apple Podcast app. So to all of you, I appreciate you. And as I always say, I only ask that you be well, be safe, and to continue to protect your nest. You've been listening to Protecting Your Nest with Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com.